All right, good morning again. Thanks for everybody for coming and making this panel part of your South by Southwest experience. My name is Mark Kierlieber. I'm a reporter at The 74. It's a national K-12 education news website where I write about issues related to student safety, well-being, and their civil rights. And I'm really excited to be joined with a pretty great group of folks here today to talk about the rise of surveillance technology in schools. So huge thanks to Education Writers Association for hosting this session. First, right here to my immediate left is Amelia Vance. She's the president of the Public Interest Privacy Center. She's advised policymakers, academics, companies, and schools on child and student privacy laws. She's absolutely the expert on anything related to like FERPA or any of the other privacy laws. So really great to have her here. We also have, to her left is Meredith Broussard. She's an associate professor at New York University and the research director of NYU's Alliance for Public Interest Technology. She has written several books on AI and data analysis. And finally, at the end there, we've got Shreya Simpeth. She's a freshman at George Washington University, and she serves on the executive board of Encode Justice, which is a youth-led coalition advocating for human rights in the digital age. So thank you all for coming. And I think that maybe it's amazing to actually have like a student voice on a panel that at a conference related to education. So I really want to like center it around the idea of student voice, and maybe we can have you start, Shreya, just talking a little bit about where you come to this conversation, and also can you maybe give me some of your personal experiences with this different kinds of surveillance technologies that exist in schools.
Yeah, sure. I can start us off. Again, I'm Shreya, and I graduated from Livingston High School in New Jersey, a public school, last year, class of 2023. And I think I really I began feeling the effects of school surveillance in middle school when one of my teachers closed a tab on my computer because I was listening to music while doing work on YouTube. And that really, clicked in the sense of, I was finally aware that, teachers were able to look at my screen and were able to monitor what I was doing, and that awareness only increased as I went through high school. And this is an experience that's shared by every student that goes to a public school or even a private school. Any student that has access to a school-sponsored computer, any technology, they will all say the same thing, that, at some point during their school career, they realized that teachers were able to look at their computers and access their search histories and be able to flag things. And there's definitely been at least one instance of them being called to, the teacher's office or the teacher's front desk, or in worst cases, the principal's office about something that they searched, maybe for a project or maybe for some type of assignment or maybe just because they were curious. So this is an experience that's shared, throughout, regardless of where you go. This is an experience, a universal experience for students. And my personal journey, varies. I think students who maybe go to schools that, have more low-income students who don't have access to computers at home, they have different experiences than I do. I luckily had a personal computer, which wasn't constantly monitored, but some students only have access to a school-sponsored computer and that's their only access to the internet, or things that they need to do for applying to jobs and things like that. So there's really a variety of experiences, but regardless of your personal journeys, you've at one point always encountered school surveillance.
Awesome, thanks. And maybe turning it to Meredith for a second here. You've written and researched a lot about AI and its potential to have biases baked into it, right? I'm curious where you come to this conversation and how those biases can play out in schools.
Sure, thank you. So I have a couple of books about artificial intelligence. The most recent one is called More Than a Glitch: Confronting Race, Gender, and Ability Bias in Tech. It actually comes out in paperback. So this is the first stop on Paperback Book Tour, which is very exciting. And one of the reasons that I wrote this book and the last one is I was increasingly disturbed by people's trust in AI systems. the way that, that people talk about AI as being neutral or more objective or more unbiased, when actually the opposite is true. All of our human biases are embedded in AI systems. And I've done some reporting around public education over the years. I did a really big project where I built an AI system to investigate whether Philadelphia public schools had the books and other learning materials that they would need in order for the students to learn the material on the state-mandated standardized tests. And I found out that the answer was no. I found out that the budget allocated to books at that time in Philadelphia was $0 per student, even though the schools had something like less than 20% of the books that they would actually need in order to learn, for the students to learn the materials on the test. So I'm really concerned with the way that that spending is allocated to these tech solutions that do not necessarily work, that are often inaccurate, are often invasive, subject the students to unnecessary surveillance, and they do this at the cost of learning. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. And I got involved in the, well, I met Shreya because I am working on a research paper right now about school surveillance technology. And so looking at things like Gaggle and GoGuardian and how effective they are, or really how ineffective they are, and what are the bias issues embedded.
Awesome, thanks. And Amelia, I'm hoping that maybe you can talk a little bit about, from a historical perspective, what are some of the factors that have really motivated school districts to buy into this kind of technology? And can you talk a little bit about the legal landscape and, yeah.
Absolutely. So let me make sure I have this on. Thank you. All right, there we go. So I actually started my work in child and student privacy a decade ago at the National Association of State Boards of Education. And so very much so starting with this idea that, okay, what do we provide to the districts in a particular state? What guidance do we give? Well, maintaining local control to make good decisions about how to adopt this. And in, late 2015, the ACLU of Massachusetts put out a report, the first one I know about, saying, hey, all of these districts in Massachusetts are using this software program called GoGuardian, and they're not telling anyone. And I was fascinated. And so I spent the next year writing a report asking what are the legitimate reasons why this is getting adopted? What are the requirements? What is the motivation behind it? Because certainly, I think one of the wonderful things about working in education and being at a conference like this one is pretty much everybody comes in with good intentions and with a desire to make things better for kids. And as I was looking at all of this, the things that really stood out was you had surveillance related to monitoring kids, not in a bad way, but in the way that schools are required to do, that they have been sued for not doing. You have a responsibility to make sure that the kids on the playground are not beating each other up. You have a requirement to make sure that bullying is not being taken too far, or you may be liable. So you had just that idea of schools needing to supervise in this new digital environment. I think most of you probably know the first state to roll out one-to-one device implementation across the state was in 2009 in Maine. And so this was still very novel. This was still something that everybody was figuring out. And so how you made sure that you were still taking care of students was important. There was also a reasoning related to administrative functions. So you had some horrible things happen, like kids getting left on a school bus or a natural disaster occurring and not knowing where kids were. and you started to see some adoption of, frankly, pretty creepy technology, like scanning student irises so people knew they got on the school bus and knew that the kids had gotten off the school bus, as well as numerous other technologies like that. And then you also have this law, the Children's Internet Protection Act, which was passed in 98 or 99, where it requires that for every school that receives E-rate funds, about 95%, they are required to filter and monitor their networks. Now, I think all of you as educators are probably aware of this, have probably seen how the filtering works, but the monitoring side of it was a lot narrower to begin with because there were computer labs. And so monitoring was the equivalent of the teacher looking over the kid's shoulder. And so a lot of the filtering companies began to expand their business to say, okay, we can also scan to see if there's cyberbullying, if there's sexting, if you can think of any sort of technological scandal that schools were held accountable for, it was very much based in, the adoption of these tools were based in trying to deal with that. But of course, it is incredibly complicated, and the pitches that they were receiving from vendors, from others, weren't necessarily focused on efficacy, weren't necessarily evidence-based, tended to bring about sort of a specter of Big Brother, and so you really started to have these questions being asked, and Mark's pretty much the foremost reporter on reporting on these. Highly encourage reading all of his books, or not books, but articles on this topic. It's amazing. Because there's so many questions about whether this even works. And when you're talking about something that has been adopted generally in good faith, you don't even need to go necessarily to the question of, is it equitable? Is it you just have to ask, is it working? And that's where a lot of this software has really fallen down at that very first step, which isn't known by a lot of districts and others who are adopting it.
I want to clear something up real quick, because you mentioned that in '99, right, the federal government began requiring schools that receive federal funding to monitor, students on the internet. Is this technology required by federal law? And if not, what are some of the alternatives that would meet that requirement?
So this is under the Federal Communications Commission, and they handily last put out guidance on this in 2002. So there is some language that was dug out in the past couple years, which says this shall not be interpreted to require all-out monitoring. But it is very much so left up to individual districts to make the decision. And when you have this legal obligation combined with, again, pressure to make sure that you're not missing a student who might be thinking of self-harm, recently, of course, thinking about, making threats or school shootings, all of that, you can sort of see where schools have felt compelled to do everything they can. But of course, it's not like there's an unlimited budget to do that, and so when you talk about whether or not it works, that's a little important.
Right. Now, we're talking about stopping, some serious issues, right? Suicide is the second leading cause of death among young people. Mass school shootings are at an all-time high. A lot of these technologies are pitched as a tool to prevent those kinds of issues. I'm curious for each of you whether or not you think that this is an appropriate way to go about that. Given the significant problems that the country faces with regard to gun violence and with youth mental health, where does this fit into that conversation?
I can start us off again. And before I continue answering that question, I want to give a little bit of context about why I'm here today. My senior year of high school, my co-colleague Marissa Syed and I, we ran the New Jersey chapter of ENCODE Justice, the organization I'm part of, and we decided to investigate the use of school surveillance in schools that we go to. So we submitted public records requests across schools in New Jersey with the help of the ACLU of New Jersey. And we found that, a lot of these school administrators had no idea what the negative impacts of this technology was. So they kind of, to answer your question, it was kind of seen as a Band-Aid solution for issues like mental health. And we found that, schools put in so much money for these technologies, over $60,000 to, invest in yearly contracts for GoGuardian, Gaggle. And if I'm wrong on that information, please do correct me. But enough money that, it could go to an actually licensed mental health professional. Now, I had the privilege of having a mental health professional in my school, dedicated to helping students. But, Marissa, for example, went to a school that was majority low income in Jersey City. And students in that school maybe did not have that resource, and technologies like GoGuardian and Gaggle and some of the features they include were used, as a solution or Band-Aid solution or just a temporary solution to address those problems, but not really. And what was really scary was to see that, administrators and even teachers weren't really aware that it was a Band-Aid solution and that it was causing more negative effects for students rather than positive. So I was, taken aback by that. But I think technical literacy is something that a lot of administrators are also lacking in. So I was, I took on the opportunity to, and Marissa did as well, educate those administrators on how this technology is actually negatively impactful. But I hope that starts us off.
Well, I'm curious more on that. Like, how do, from your experiences, how do students tend to view these technologies? What, how does it alter their behavior? And are they coming up with ways to bypass the system to do whatever they want anyway?
So it's been really interesting as I've been researching this over, the past 9 years. Because there's been a mix. I've heard anecdotes, and this is part of the problem. We mostly have anecdotes. We don't have actual well-researched studies. We have anecdotes that there are kids who have used monitoring software to ask for help without asking for help. So maybe typing a bunch of swear words into a Google Doc or something like that. You have some students who are like, yeah, I'm watched all the time. I don't care at this point. But the students who are often harmed the most are those from marginalized populations, where the more they know about how much monitoring is taking place, the more they're less likely to get the help they need, whether they're LGBT, whether they are looking up, questions about sexual activity and what keeps you from getting pregnant, whether they're even looking up, information about mental health challenges. And this stuff just this really gets inhibited. And you start having kids more and more maybe just keep it inside. And we know that is much more likely to lead to harm than others. I also want to make the point that just detecting these things, of course, it's like step 0.01. And a lot of schools don't have the resources once a child is identified as maybe at risk of self-harm. And again, efficacy is a big question here, but they don't necessarily have that counselor or someone else that can take the next step. And we have really clear research that says the number one thing that helps a kid thinking about self-harm, thinking about harming others, just doing well in school is having a trusted adult in their life that they can talk to. And unfortunately, in many schools, that trusted adult may actually be spending a bunch of time looking at the flags raised by this software as opposed to being able to directly engage and have relationships with students.
Right. So there's been a lot of conversation just in the space of artificial intelligence in general, right, about how biases are kind of baked in it because they are tools that are created by humans, right? So Meredith, I'm curious on your thoughts on this. Is this a glitch? Is this something that can be overcome, or are these biases just inherent in the products?
Well, I would say it's more than a glitch, really. What happens, I think, is that when we have these situations like, a kid who is searching for information about LGBTQIA plus identity gets flagged and gets sent to the principal's office, we should look at that not as an example of, just as an example of the technology working badly, but we should look at it as an example of a larger social problem that we need to look at. Like, this is a kid who's not getting enough support, and also, or maybe the kid is getting sufficient support and they're just curious and it's a problem that LGBTQ content is getting flagged, like simple searches, right? Because we know that computers are pretty bad at nuance, at context, right? So one of the things that I would encourage everybody to do when looking at these kinds of technologies is to assume discrimination by default. Right, so this is an idea that comes from Ruha Benjamin's really amazing book, Race After Technology. She has a new book out about imagining different worlds that are possible with technology. And the basic idea is that for a very long time, we've been assuming that technology works and that it is better than people. And that is not a safe assumption, okay? These are machine learning systems that are just doing statistics, right? We all know that there are limits to statistics. Statistics are not great at nuance, at context. And the other thing that we know is that people embed their own biases in the technologies that they create. Now, we all have unconscious bias. We're all trying to become better people every day, but we all have unconscious bias and we can't see it because it's unconscious. Silicon Valley specifically has a diversity problem, as in there's not enough diversity. And so what happens in groups of technologists is it tends to be these homogeneous groups of people, and then the technologies they create get the collective unconscious biases of the group of the people creating the technologies. And then that gets rolled out to these very, very different communities, right? And so we can assume that all of the biases of the human world are embedded in these technologies that are being created. And so one of the things we can do is we can look for those kinds of problems and do a better job of anticipating them. But it starts with having a more critical view of the technologies themselves, of pushing back against an idea called techno-chauvinism, right? And just understanding that the technology is not flawless, that it's going to screw up in very human ways, in unexpected digital ways, and it's not a panacea. It's not going to fix the problem. So if it's a human problem, if it needs a human solution, like more trusted adults, you're not going to fix it by using an app.
Just something that came to mind. I want to note too that the idea of sort of the human in the loop is often held up as the solution. You have a human checking the results. But one of the things that just continues to shock me from the pandemic, you had one of the proctoring companies that decided they were no longer going to have their product not have a human at the company review whether or not a student had potentially cheated. And it was because only 6% of college professors we're checking to verify whether the machine was right.
What's a proctoring tool?
So it is when you are taking a test. It's basically often a webcam watching you. It often has you scan what's in the room around you, trying to avoid you cheating. And in addition to significant problems about having a discriminatory effect on students with disabilities, students who may even just need to read the answers or like word them. You have all sorts of false flags. The proctoring companies, for their many, many flaws, like going after teachers union in California, I have many feelings, they were very clear. Tests are high stakes. And you should double check every single result here, and made it pretty easy to do so. Here's the part that we think is suspicious. You can double check and see if you think that the student might be cheating. But we have limited time and limited resources. And even in that high stakes situation, you didn't have educators checking that. And that's incredibly concerning. And so we need to consider not only how we deal with the technology itself, but how we deal with the humans that are dealing with the technology who may be assuming that the technology knows a lot more despite arguments to the contrary or warnings from the company that this should be double checked.
I mean, the technology is just really badly made nowadays. Technology had a reputation for a long time as being flawless, but it's put together with duct tape and bubble gum the same way everything else is. One of the things we do in data journalism, a kind of classic story, is looking at bridge inspections, right? Because you need to inspect bridges regularly, and you need to maintain them because otherwise they fall down and people die, right? So bridge inspection story is a kind of classic story because people don't inspect the bridges enough, and that's one of the reasons the bridges fall down. So one of the things you can do also is you can look at these school surveillance technologies, or really any kind of education technologies for the writers in the room. And you can kind of look at, okay, how well are these things put together? How well are they inspected? How well are they maintained? You can kind of audit them. Algorithmic auditing is the keyword that you want to look up. And, you know, stuff is just really not very well made. And so that's another reason that it's glitching all over the place.
And I want to mention too, I'm trying to remember what FACT stands for, the conference.
Fairness, accountability, and transparency.
It can be really helpful for journalists to take a look at some of the papers that come out of this conference and some of the talks because, sorry, I have a cold, getting over it, but you can find out the stuff that just isn't possible, that is being marketed as possible, like detecting whether an essay was written with AI.
Not possible.
You can't. You absolutely cannot. And so just being able to know those things and then look at the marketing on some of the websites around this allows you to draw attention to the fact that a lot of people don't know what they're talking about or are assuming that, you know, this idea of technological, you know, omniscience is possible. So highly, highly recommend checking out the conference papers. They are incredibly helpful.
Sorry, I wanted to add really quickly that idea of AI, you know, being able to check whether that's not real, but schools are using it and teachers are using it. Just a few days ago, ENCODE Justice is working on collecting student testimonies from students by students because I think there's a real gap in student voices in this space, and I'm excited to bring that on, but there's also experiences all across the country that aren't really being highlighted or talked about at all. So one of the things that I came across when we were working on this is a report of 2 students being called to the principal's office because their essays were marked as AI generated when, you know, they were actually written by the person, but teachers weren't trusting student testimonies about that. They weren't trusting a student testifying that they wrote the essay and that ChatGPT did not write it. I think there's a multitude of issues with that because, first of all, I use ChatGPT for my college, brainstorming process. And I think at the college level, at least, AI policy is a bit more developed in that some of my professors do encourage using ChatGPT. But this is, just in general discouraging students from even looking at that resource really as a tool. And it really, puts students who might need that resource at risk. And it also, in general, polices students more than they need to be policed. Because if I'm writing an essay with my own words and I'm still being marked as, having my essay being 60% written by ChatGPT or more, and I get a 0 on my essay and my professor will not hear the end of it about my testimony and trust technology more than me, that really, puts me in a bad place. And I think that technology bias is very prevalent amongst teachers and professors and administrators. So I just wanted to add that.
And disproportionately affects English language learners. It absolutely cannot detect when an English language learner has written something versus AI. So you're just having a massive discriminatory effect there.
And see, as a writing instructor, I would be perfectly happy if an English language learner wrote something and then put it into an AI tool in order to proofread it. Right? Because that allows them to understand, okay, well, I should word this sentence differently. Like, that's a completely reasonable use of an AI technology. Let me also mention digital watermarking. I'm just going to get really nerdy for a second. I apologize.
Please.
So the thing about AI detection, right, about technologies that claim to detect whether something is created by AI or not, is they just do not work right now. There has been a consensus among the big tech companies. They got together at the White House and agreed that they were going to implement voluntary standards around digital watermarking. And so the idea is that there will be a kind of mathematical fingerprint in anything that is created by an AI. And so then a program could read that mathematical fingerprint that is invisibly embedded and could tell that, oh, yeah, there's a watermark that says this was generated by AI, which is a great idea. It is not happening yet and is not happening anytime soon. Like, hopefully it will happen and it will work, but both of those things are up in the air right now. One of the reasons that the tech companies have done this is that machine learning models, right, LLMs or large language models, which are these things that generate new text, images, videos, what have you, this generative AI is really fragile. Okay, so it's trained, an AI like ChatGPT is trained on a bunch of text, images, videos, whatever, scraped from the internet. You take all of this data, this massive amount of data, millions of billions of web pages, dump it into the computer and say, computer, make a model. The model shows the mathematical patterns in the data, and this is what we can use to generate new text, right? But a model, when you feed it with new information that has been generated by an AI, well, it deteriorates faster. Okay, so there's something called model drift or model decay that happens over time, right? So models become less accurate over time because the world changes, and the model is trained on the world as it was at a snapshot in time. So you have to update models all the time. And these updates do not work unless you're only feeding it with information that has been generated by people, right? Because the AI-generated material makes the model deteriorate faster. So it's in the tech company's best interests to develop this digital watermarking technology, and that's one of the reasons that they agreed to do it.
I mean, that's really interesting. So if you've spent any time on TikTok, you'll know that young people have kind of adopted new languages to get around its algorithm because it really tries to downgrade anything that mentions the word like suicide or killed. So they'll say something like unalive instead. As do these technologies have systems in place to kind of identify just the way that people talk and the way that people's languages change over time?
whack-a-mole. I mean, it's with everything else in education, like with the school districts who banned all the chat apps and students started using Google Docs to chat with each other. Like there's a level of inevitability about it. And so we just have to do the best with what we have as things evolve.
So a judge in Ohio, I think it was a few years back now, ruled that a university had violated a student's constitutional rights when they used this tool called HonorLock. It's one of these proctoring tools, and it required the students, before taking a test, to scan their bedrooms or wherever they're taking the test to verify that there wasn't somebody else in their room helping them, or that they didn't have any other materials open. And you know, the judge did find that that scan violated the students' rights to against unreasonable searches. Given the growth in remote and online learning, especially since the pandemic, I mean, how does the fact that kids are learning at home but are being monitored at school or by their schools, how does that kind of complicate the landscape?
So there's an infographic, that I guess was released at the end of 2021, where we were trying to map out what are the different types of monitoring and filtering technology. How do they keep the data? How do they get rid of the data? And so a large part of that was, are they creating a profile of the student? Are they just being used when it's on a school device? Or are they also being used when they log into their Microsoft for Education or Google for Education accounts at home, which, yes, it's usually being monitored. And so parents may be monitored at that point too if they don't log out of the account. You just have such a broad swath of this showing up, and it makes it very difficult to get away from. And again, there's some good reasons for this. Kids can be brutal. Kids can cyberbully other kids. And schools do have a responsibility to make sure that they're paying attention to what is done on the technology that they provided and that they built. But it has become so overexpansive. And it'll be interesting. There was a First Amendment case 2 years ago now about off-campus speech. And there was a beautiful footnote in the dissent where the majority of the court had said that schools should be able to monitor school devices. Like, that was a very broad right. And I think it was Justice Alito, which was like, hey, there's this case from 2015 where schools were turning on the camera of the laptop in kids' bedrooms and then trying to punish them for potentially taking drugs, which turned out to be, I think, good and plenty. And so I don't think the majority of the court would find that appropriate. So there's some ambiguity on the constitutional side there.
What's next? So certainly technology is always evolving and becoming more sophisticated, right? We're seeing in schools a lot more like surveillance cameras that have object detection or different kinds of facial recognition built into them. One of the companies that produces these student digital monitoring tools now has like a therapy service that they offer as like, hey, we've identified you as potentially, thinking about self-harm. Here's like our in-house therapist who can like help you. I mean, where do you see like this kind of industry and, headed from now?
Okay, I can start. Well, as a former public school student, I do see that students are becoming more aware of this technology. I was, when I was explaining to my friends that I was coming to Austin for a day in between my midterms, I mentioned that, this is what I would be talking about, and I could just see a bulb go up in their head about, the fact that they'd been subjected to this for so many years. And I think more students are becoming aware of it, and hopefully, will bring it up to their teachers and administrators, and express that they feel that as though their privacy is being infringed upon, which it is. And I think that's one development that's really encouraging. And another one is conversations like this, the fact that we're talking about how these technologies are harmful, and the fact that there are educators in this room, hopefully, who are listening and taking that into account. That's really encouraging. And I think in general, there's just more awareness about mental health issues and things like that, and that it incentivizes, honestly, school administrators to invest more in real solutions instead of apps. So maybe hiring a school and a mental health school therapist who's actually licensed. I think that's becoming more encouraged, and even parents are taking on that issue and advocating for it. So I think general increase in awareness is something that is a positive development that I've been seeing, but I'm sure you guys have other thoughts.
One of the things that I do in my class, in my data journalism class, in order to help students understand surveillance, is I do a couple of educational activities. So one is I use the learning management system that my university uses, and I pull my view of it up on the screen, and I show them how I can see what they're clicking on, right? And so I tell them, listen, I never use this, but I think you should know that it exists, right? Because I get all these messages about, oh, you should be using this feature to see, what percentage of the students have done the reading. And I'm like, yeah, no, I'm not gonna get all up in your business to that level. And then the other thing that we do is the students have an assignment where they have to look at their personal data on one of the platforms. So on all of the different platforms nowadays, you can download your personal data. So on Amazon, I think it's called Download My Archive. On Twitter, you can get a package of your data. You can get your Spotify data, all of the platforms. So they make it difficult, right? It's not easy to find. It's kind of hidden in some submenus, but it's there. So one of the assignments is go and download your data from a platform and visualize it, look at it, and just write about what you found. How do you feel about this? What did you discover about yourself? Which is usually, not anything that they didn't know already. And also, one of the things I think is powerful about this assignment is looking at what the platforms have compiled as a profile on you and how wrong it is usually, right? So that is one of the interventions that I'm using, and it helps the students understand surveillance a little bit more and gives them a sense of agency, and also allows them to turn off some of the platform surveillance mechanisms.
And I think there's a new app for that. Somebody just sent it to me of how you fix the privacy settings that I was very excited to see. But I think it's important to flag when you're looking at the different types of technology, the ones that actually actively build a profile are the ones that I get more nervous about, not because the ones that are just filtering and then flags the word gay isn't a problem, because it absolutely is. But there's a number of these that are creating a profile that no one's really paying attention to, that the school may or may not realize is happening. And data minimization is hard. I always love to come back to New Jersey, which, as of the last time I looked, I think 6 months ago, requires that schools keep health data in the permanent record for 100 years. What? So, yeah, because once upon a time, it just meant vaccinations. And now with community health services, all of that, data retention laws across the country are really difficult. And I think it was Wisconsin, they're required to keep for a certain period of time voice recordings. And then teachers started bringing Alexa to school. And so you both have these outdated record retention laws, but you also have a lack of time for administrators and others to go through, and again, a lack of awareness that these profiles exist. And so we're just building up this storehouse of information of everything a kid Googles, writes, counseling workbooks, as you found, Mark, with some of the stuff, like all of this just existing. And it's not necessarily something that, first of all, students know to ask about. And there's also some questions about whether, before the school administrator looks at it and takes action on it, like you violated this policy, whether it's even covered by FERPA and therefore whether parents or students have access. And so it's really messy, and as we look at data breaches, as we look at these other issues, how do we minimize the types of data collecting incredibly sensitive information that unfortunately could stigmatize them in the future and prevent opportunities? And that's something I think that just isn't talked about enough.
I would also say that the data breaches are inevitable.
Yeah.
All collections of data are vulnerable. Everything is going to be breached sooner or later. People often imagine that that computational data is secure. It is not, right? One of the ways that I encourage people to think about it is, I think about the SoulCycle lockers. So if you've ever been to a SoulCycle class, they have these lockers where you can put your stuff in and you can put a combination on. And you're like, oh, I'm the only one who knows the combination to this locker. My stuff is really safe. But actually, everybody at the front desk has a key to all of the lockers. And then when you inevitably forget your combination, they come over with the key and they start opening the lock, because you can't remember sometimes which locker you put your stuff in. So they go around and like open all the lockers until they find the one that has your stuff in it. They're like, oh, okay, here you go. Right? So every digital system is like the SoulCycle locker. You put your stuff in and you think that you're the only one with the key or the password, but there's always somebody who has root access. There's always somebody with a key, and especially at startups that don't have a level of kind of HR in place to control access, people just poke around in each other's data, right? We saw this at Uber. There was a big scandal a few years ago where Uber had this thing called God mode. And what people would do is just like look at their friends' ride histories or look up celebrities' ride histories. Like it's irresistible poking around in other people's data because you feel like you have access to secrets. Okay, so like, yes, that's always going to happen. And breaches are inevitable. So the data is always going to be released somehow. And then it's all going to be out there, like keys to the SoulCycle lockers.
And it's not just about social security numbers. I remember I sat in a presentation maybe 8 years ago where a superintendent was presenting and somebody asked about privacy and he's like, well, we don't have social security numbers, we don't have credit cards, nobody's going to want it. And then, of course, I think, 2 years later, we had the Dark Overlord, this hacker group that went in, sent death threats to students, was watching through some of the school cameras in tiny districts. This wasn't any of the big ones. This was targeted, as it turned out. They wanted to piss off the FBI. And they were actually the hacker group that put up the new season of Orange is the New Black before it was supposed to come out. We're based out of the UK, but you had letters being sent to administrators saying, we're going to come and we're going to harm your students. And so districts were shutting down for 10 days. So they tried to figure out where this was coming from. Is this an actual threat? You had, again, texts going out. You had these videos. The data we have in schools is not innocuous. It matters, especially to individual students. And so we need the protections, which often includes deleting the data when we don't need it anymore, in place to avoid that sort of thing from happening.
Awesome. And we're getting close to the end here, so I do hope to have a few minutes to open the floor here to any questions, if you have any. There's the microphone in the middle of the room if you can go there to answer, to ask any questions that you might have. And please identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Trish Crane, and I write for Alabama Education Lab and AL.com, and this is just fascinating to me. I'm a huge fan of Mark's. Everything he writes, I try to understand. I have a question about, y'all are talking about the apps that students use. What about, I've had questions, parents are asked to, hey, download these apps so you can keep in touch with what's happening. Do you find problems with those as well? I mean, are those, so there's nothing that's innocuous, nothing that doesn't matter. Okay, that's terrifying. But
I will also say that I am a computer scientist. I have never been able to get the app at my kid's school to work. So that's the level we're talking about here.
You also have a lot of schools that, in trying to meet parents where they are, will say, let's have a Facebook group. And then you have parents and kids, probably young kids, having to sign up for a Facebook account. And we know the level of tracking that occurs there. Now, is there an actual harm other than ads following them around on the internet, which is its own thing? Maybe, maybe not. But it's a massive problem that people just don't think about because they don't know the extent that we're tracked both online and offline.
right, and just to follow up, because I am trying to figure out an entryway into this topic for Alabama. Another problem that the teachers, like Amelia, I know I've had the pleasure of being in that caucus and I heard all of your expertise, but teachers don't and administrators don't really seem to understand what's at risk. I mean, is that a widespread problem? Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Colleges of teacher education don't have courses on this. I took an education law class when I was in law school that was joint with the School of Education. We skipped the FERPA chapter. And that was for administrators. That wasn't for educators. That was for administrators. It's not something that's covered. And so one of the things I was able to develop with my team a few years ago was here is scenarios that puts these laws into something that teachers can look at to be oh, here's how to think about this in a common sense way, because it's not about knowing about the school official exception or audit and evaluation or what a legitimate educational interest is. It's oftentimes about common sense, just knowing the potential harms and then applying them to the day-to-day work that teachers and administrators do. But I really think colleges of teacher education have fallen down on dealing with this.
Yeah, and I do want to add, I think when I was conversing with administrators about, what kind of data that we were requesting in our public records request, they weren't even aware that they could access the data of students and, put it into an Excel sheet. They were just completely unaware of that. And I, had to look at the manual and give them instructions on how to do that, which is discouraging. So, obviously administrators who are buying the technology don't really know how to even use it, which is scary. And I think, we mentioned this at the beginning, everyone who buys this technology comes in with good intentions, whether that's, teachers using it to make sure that students are staying on track with schoolwork, or if it's administrators, wanting to protect students. But I think teachers and administrators really don't consider the fact that, surveillance, it gets into the head of people, and it even, moderates what they, end up looking up, and it affects their education, really. So that's a little, yeah.
Another journalistic way to think about it is to think about where is the data going. So it's not just about data leakage, but it's about data pipelines. So there was a story a couple of years ago that I think won a Pulitzer, and it was about the Pasco County Sheriff's Office. What they did was they had built these predictive policing models that predicted who they thought would be future criminals, right? So they worked really badly, and then police went out and harassed the people who had been identified by these models. Well, another thing that they did was then they got a data pipeline from the schools, from the local schools, and use things like attendance and discipline data in order to build models and identify who they thought, which
Which
kids
the school
they-
didn't know was being sent to the school resource officers who were logging into these systems. It was,
Yeah. So this is happening all over the place. The fact that people don't know where the data is going or what data is available out of systems is really important. So you can do some good work around just figuring out, okay, what are these systems? What are the common points of leakage, and figuring out, does the school actually have a policy for monitoring this? If no, then it's probably leaking and being misused somewhere.
can always ask a company too, just really quick, do they have a way for the school to see who accessed the data? Because there's a shockingly low number of companies that allow you to see this user access this data at this time, and that's so basic, because that's how you find out who might be abusing the system.
Yeah, and it's always possible. It's just not always a feature that's been built or made available to customers.
I think the conversation was relevant to the question that I was going to ask. So my name is Huma Hamid, and I work in tech. I work in building the system. So maybe a slightly different perspective here. As employees working with big tech companies, we are used to being, our everything that we do using our office monitors or equipment that is being monitored, and we know that it happens. We just learn how to stay within that, like how to keep our personal life and our professional activities like separate. I'm just curious how education and student persona is different when it comes to collecting this data and then using that data. And what is the role do you see the parents? Because I don't know what data is being collected for my children and how it's being used. But where I work, I do know that I need to keep these things separate if I want to protect my my job, or I don't want to share too much information with my company. So that's one question. And secondly, a lot of the conversation seems to be from somebody who works on these systems, and we collect data not with the intention. We talked about intention. We don't collect the data with the intention to hurt somebody. A lot of times the data is being collected to create personalization. If I know your history, I may be able to give you a better experience, in the platform. So how do we draw the line between, the problem is the data collection, or the problem is the ethical use of that data, or the person who is giving permission and the person who is collecting the data is going to use it in a way that it's not hurtful. So I think that's where I feel like the conversation was a little overlapping, and I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
So I teach EU data protection law in addition to privacy law, and love comparing the frameworks, because the EU, for all of this sort of, oh my goodness, it's the most privacy protective ever, the way their privacy laws are framed is around enabling uses of data. And in fact, if you look at laws like HIPAA in the US, the privacy part of it is a paragraph that was put in as a safeguard so that data could be shared electronically. And so it's not about necessarily not collecting certain information. It's about asking, do you actually need it? Is what you're collecting for personalization actually helpful, useful? Are you minimizing who can access it? Just basically all of the fair information practice principles, which I know isn't something that a lot of ed tech employees and others are even familiar with at this point. And so as soon as they find out about these different concepts, they're like, oh my goodness, I'm going to change my approach on this. I want to take these things into account. But it's really difficult because people don't think about the potential unintended consequences. But there are a lot of toolkits that are amazing, and happy to share some of those.
And unfortunately, we're coming up on the time here, so I think maybe we could do like one more question and then we'll wrap it up. But maybe if the other folks who have questions want to.
listen to all the questions and then
Can we?
do lightning round?
Run, ask them as quick as you can.
I'll try to
Everybody,
speak as
lightning
quickly
round.
as I can. My name is Jasmine Owens. I'm a pre-K-12 policy advisor for New America, a national nonprofit organization. I wanted to ask about the issue of data sharing with, you mentioned like school resource officers. I wrote a brief on behavioral threat assessment, and data sharing with local law enforcement is built into many of these programs. So I would love to hear your perspective about like what are alternatives, what are some of the policy conversations you're having on ways to avoid that kind of data sharing and profile creation of students, and how to manage that data that is collected in states that have really bought into some of these programs.
There's a very long answer to that. Stick around and I will talk through it. But basically, police have to separate their brain when they're in schools into two separate ways in FERPA. One is they are a school resource officer who may be teaching, who may be engaged, and they can have access to student records in certain circumstances. And the other is they're going back to their police department. And none of the data they get over here can go over there. And imagine how few people are actually trained on that. And so it's hard to forget something. And so it's an absolute mess and something where FERPA really needs to be clarified and updated.
Thank you.
And also predictive policing algorithms do not work well at all and are inevitably biased against already marginalized groups.
Go for it.
Great conversation, so I'll be really quick. I'm wondering, do you have data sets that point us to what's working well, as well as we're creating, I'm from TCIA, Twin Cities Innovation Alliance out of Minneapolis, forgot about that part, but data primers. You know, we are working with toolkits and educating community members so they can take this into action. How does these scenarios show up as a parent, as an educator, or with FERPA, as you just mentioned? Tools, tips, and tricks.
So I missed a part of that, but.
What works well, I guess, is
Yeah.
the question.
Oh, what works well?
So,
There's a lot. There's a ton of different resources on what states have experimented with, what districts have experimented with, model policies, model checklists, communication kits for parents, all sorts of stuff. Unfortunately, the internet is a big place and it's hard to find. And so actually one of the goals of my nonprofit is like, here's this thing from 6 years ago that might be useful. So please feel free to reach out, anyone in the audience, and
I can do that.
happy
Thank
to nerd out and provide stuff.
all right, appreciate it. Thank you.
I will also say that the last two chapters of my book, More Than a Glitch, are about the positive side. When I was writing the book, it was all about, all of this disastrous stuff. And, I get that it's hard to listen to. Like, I'm a little bit of a negative Nelly sometimes, but it is not all doom and gloom. Like, there is some okay stuff out there. And so the last two chapters are about that. And public interest technology as a field is something I'm really optimistic about.
Yeah, and last thing, I would say talk to students, just bring it up in casual conversation, and you'll find that they really have some insightful thoughts about this because, I've grown up under this technology, they've also grown up under it, and they're, one of the first users of it, or directly, I think, the most impacted by it. So just, bring it up to, someone in the age range of like 14 to 18 even, or even younger than that, and I'm sure they'll have something important to say.
Check out Encode Justice.
Yeah, check out Encode Justice, guys. Yeah.
And on that note, that wraps up the session. So thank you all for coming, and thanks to the panelists for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you.